Welcome back to Disturbed Reality. When discussions about Latin American organised crime arise, the image that dominates the headlines and social media is almost always that of Mexican drug cartels. From the notorious exploits of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman to the brutal violence of the Jalisco New Generation cartel, CJNG, Mexico's drug underworld has become a global media fixture. Documentaries, podcasts, books, and Hollywood thrillers have built an empire of narratives around them. Yet despite their deadly reputation, there exists a criminal underworld arguably even more dangerous, more brazen, and more destabilizing: Brazil's drug gangs. Strikingly, these groups receive far less global media coverage. The reasons for this disparity are complex but rooted in language barriers, media access, and international political focus. Nonetheless, Brazil's narco landscape has cultivated violent networks that pose immense threats to its society and institutions. Unlike Mexico, where cartels have operated with international drug trafficking as their primary purpose, Brazilian gangs evolved from a unique context, that being the country's deeply unequal urban development and its carceral system. The favelas, informal housing settlements that emerged due to rapid urbanization and socio-economic marginalization, became breeding grounds for organized crime. The two most dominant factions in Brazil today are Comando Vermelho Red Command and the Primeiro Comando de Capital, PCC. Comando Vermelho was formed in the 1970s inside Rio de Janeiro's prisons, initially by political prisoners and common criminals. Over time, it evolved into a sophisticated criminal organisation, controlling vast swaths of Rio's favelas. The PCC, founded in the early 1990s in Sao Paulo's prisons, took a different path. Rooted in a philosophy of self-governance within prisons, the PCC rapidly grew into a massive drug trafficking empire with operations not only across Brazil, but in neighbouring countries like Paraguay and Bolivia, and even reaching Europe. The power of Brazilian drug gangs is maintained through extreme violence, territorial control, and social coercion. Unlike Mexican cartels, which often clash with each other in rural or border regions, Brazilian factions maintain a firm grip over urban territory. The favelas are not just hideouts, they are strongholds. Gangs in these areas exert authority rivaling and often surpassing that of the state. Residents are subjected to curfews, informal justice systems, and constant surveillance. In areas like Complexo do Alamo and Rochina in Rio, or the sprawling peripheries of Sao Paulo, the gangs control daily life, from commerce to conflict resolution. Any breach of their rules is often met with public executions or disappearances, or punishments. These gangs are not just enforcers of violence, they are pseudo-states. They provide services where the state fails, including basic healthcare, security, and food distribution. During the COVID-19 pandemic, some factions imposed lockdowns before the government did, illustrating the extent of their control. Brazilian gangs have also carried out some of the most horrific acts of violence in Latin America, but these incidents often go underreported internationally. Massacres are a grim feature of Brazil's war on drugs and turf wars between gangs and police. One of the most brutal examples is the Jaceresino massacre in May 2021. In what was supposed to be a police raid targeting gang members, 28 people were killed in the favela of Jaceresino in Rio de Janeiro, making it the deadliest police operation in the city's history. Though the government claimed that the raid was successful, human rights groups described it as a massacre. Eyewitnesses reported extrajudicial killings, torture, and the planting of evidence. Yet the massacre is just one of many. The Carandiru massacre of 1992, which occurred inside a Sao Paulo prison, resulted in the deaths of 111 inmates during a police crackdown on a riot, an event that catalyzed the PCC's rise. In more recent years, the state of Ceará has witnessed coordinated gang riots in prisons, with hundreds murdered and decapitated in a series of internal gang wars. Police officers are not spared in this violence. In 2023 alone, over 50 officers were murdered in Rio de Janeiro alone. These killings are often retaliatory, following police incursions into gang territories. In some cases, officers are ambushed in their homes, on their way to work, or even kidnapped and executed. These gangs have also assassinated judges, politicians, and journalists. Their reach is terrifyingly deep. Beyond violence, Brazilian drug gangs wield tremendous political and economic influence. Corruption of law enforcement, prison officials, and politicians is widespread. A 2022 investigation revealed that the PCC had successfully infiltrated multiple branches of the judicial system and police in Sao Paulo, with some officials accepting bribes to release high-ranking members or to tamper with evidence on existing cases. Moreover, political candidates, particularly at the municipal level, have been found to be backed by gang money. Some run for office with direct support from local factions, offering immunity from police raids in return for votes. This intertwining of organised crime and politics severely undermines Brazil's already fragile democratic institutions. Unlike their Mexican counterparts who focus heavily on North America, Brazilian gangs have expanded southward and eastward. The PCC controls much of the cocaine trafficking through Paraguay and Bolivia, and has established strongholds in the tri-border area, a notorious hotspot of illicit trade near Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. From there, the cocaine is funneled through ports like Santos, Brazil's busiest, to Europe and Africa. This international expansion has brought them into conflict and contact with global criminal groups, including the Italian 'Ndrangheta and Balkan crime syndicates. In 2022, a European police operation dismantled a cocaine trafficking ring directly connected to the PCC, illustrating how deeply embedded these Brazilian gangs are in the global narco economy. In my opinion, given the scale and brutality of Brazilian gangs, the lack of international media coverage is puzzling. Several factors contribute to this media silence. Much of the reporting on Brazil is in Portuguese, limiting the international media's access. Mexican cartels operate in a Spanish-speaking environment more accessible to Western journalists and audiences. The United States has a vested interest in Mexican cartels due to the shared borders and the flow of drugs going into American cities. Brazil's gangs, while international, don't directly affect the US to the same extent. This may also be why Brazilian drug gangs, such as PCC and Comando Vermelho, haven't been designated terrorist organizations like various Mexican drug cartels. Reporting from Brazilian favelas is dangerous, journalists are routinely threatened, and several have been killed. Independent reporting is difficult, and large media outlets often rely on official police statements, which are frequently biased or inaccurate. There's also a tendency in Western media to exoticize Mexico's narco culture, from narco corridos to cartel glamorization. Brazilian drug gang culture lacks that same mythologized narrative, despite being no less deadly. The consequences of unchecked gang violence are profound, and Brazil has one of the highest homicide rates in the world, with over 47,000 murders in 2023, many directly or indirectly linked to drug trafficking and gang violence. Bear in mind, this doesn't take into account the huge number of people who go missing every year. Entire generations of youth in the favelas are caught in cycles of poverty, addiction, and crime. Schools, healthcare, and infrastructure in gang-controlled areas are under constant threat. Meanwhile, the public trust in law enforcement is eroded by both the brutality of police operations and their collusion with criminal elements. Brazil's incarceration rate is also the third highest in the world, and its prisons are overflowing, many effectively run by the very gangs that they are supposed to contain. The psychological toll on the population is immense. Daily life in many urban peripheries is punctuated by gunfire, military-style police raids, and the constant fear of being caught in crossfire or targeted by gang reprisals. While Mexican drug cartels dominate international media, Brazilian drug gangs continue to operate in the shadows of global attention, despite being arguably more entrenched, more brutal, and more politically corrosive. Their influence pervades Brazil's urban centres, prisons, borders, and even its political institutions. The underreporting of their activities not only distorts the global understanding of organised crime, but also allows their violence to persist with relative impunity. Greater international awareness, investigative journalism, and a multilateral pressure are essential to shine light on Brazil's hidden war. Until then, the country will continue to bleed from an internal conflict that rarely makes headlines, but devastates lives daily. Ultimately, Brazil, as of right now, could be considered a narco state, and the level of brutality in several regions of the country is utterly shocking. They may not be as propaganda savvy as Mexican drug cartels, nor as well known, but make no mistake, at the very least, they are just as brutal. Well, in actuality, they are probably even more deadly. Today, we will explore a couple of brutal videos perpetrated by gangs within the country of Brazil. But nevertheless, what happens in the actual videos? The first clip some refer to as Kill Room, which I think is somewhat misleading. I assume that the video is titled that, as the room in which it occurs in looks like a cartel slaughter room. Think Funky Town, tiled floor, relatively empty, etc. But I actually think this video is more of a home invasion, and that the victim was ambushed in his place of residence. I think this as there seems to be other people in the house. It seems like you can hear somebody else shouting in another room, possibly a gang member shouting at somebody else related to the victim in the house. Regardless, as you play the video, you are met with the sight of the captive, who is a relatively young man, probably in his early to mid-20s. The clip has been shot at night. The room in which the gruesome incident transpires is quite dark. You see the captive laying down on his stomach, on a tiled floor. It may be a kitchen, though it's hard to tell. The victim is making strange groaning sounds. He's already in severe pain due to torture that took place off camera, though what type of torture is unknown. A hitman can be seen standing over him in the dark, ominously. He lines up a machete against the back of the victim's neck, and he proceeds to strike the back of the neck 4 times with the blade, though it seems incredibly blunt. When the victim is struck with the machete, it causes thudding sounds that echo throughout the room. The captive rolls over instinctively in an attempt to get away from the hitman, and he lets out short, sharp shrieks as he does this. Again, the noises are intensified due to the echoey room. The victim rolls over onto his back, and you see the tiled floor beneath him begin to puddle with blood, so despite the machete being blunt, it has still caused severe lacerations. The victim is kicked by the hitman, and he rolls over to his side, which makes him place his hand on the white wall next to him, and a bloody handprint is left behind. The captive screams for mercy at this point. He rolls over back onto his back and tries to scoot away from his attacker, but to no avail. He crawls over to the side of a room, which has a doorway, and he attempts to get up, but in doing so, he gives up the back of his neck, and the hitman takes the opportunity to strike the victim again in that area a further 4 or 5 more times, but this time he does it much harder. The captive lets out a piercing screech, begging for mercy, and you see blood splatters beginning to spray against the white wall. The video jump cuts, and it shows the victim getting back up to his feet, seemingly allowed to by the hitmen. He looks groggy due to the blood loss. He places his elbow against the wall for balance, but he collapses back onto the ground. He leaves a huge blood mark on the wall behind. The victim has essentially gone through the doorway into the hallway of the house, and he is on his hands and knees, trying to crawl, though the blood loss is taking its toll on the victim. At this point, a hitman, not the same one with the machete, brandishes a shotgun, which I believe is a Mossberg. He aims it at the victim's head from close range, mocking the captive for a few seconds, before pulling the trigger. This drops the victim onto his stomach, though, despite a shotgun being used, the victim's head remains relatively intact. I'm presuming that the shell used was a slug and not a buckshot. At this point, somehow, the captive is still moving, so a hitman takes a pistol and puts one more bullet into the victim's skull, making sure he's dead. The video ends as the house is covered in blood. It was a frenzied and utterly brutal murder. The fact it was filmed in a tiled room also makes the sounds much more unbearable. From what I gather, the video is at least a year old, but possibly older, though I have no idea in regards to which gang perpetrated the killing. Now, the next video I would argue is much more brutal, though again, much like the first clip, I can't find any context behind it in regards to what gang was responsible for this heinous murder. This may be me reaching, but the victim is wearing a black and red striped shirt that looks like a football jersey. It may be the team jersey for a Brazilian football team called Recife. Recife being the state capital of Pernambuco in the northeast region of Brazil. And although Recife isn't a hotspot for Brazilian gangs, Commando Vermelho do operate in the area, and the colours of the football jersey matches the gang colours of CV. Again, this may be me putting 2 and 2 together and coming up with 5. Regardless, the video is a longer one at 2 minutes and 32 seconds in length, and the clip has been shot in a forest type area during nighttime. You hear the chirps of insects echo throughout the forest, giving an eerie backdrop. There's also an instrumental playing lightly in the background. It's like a horror type instrumental that I have heard in a couple of other similar videos from Brazil in the past. As you play the video, you are met with a close-up of the captive's face and he's covered in blood, seemingly previously beaten up by his captors. A man can be heard aggressively asking questions to the captive, and the captive, sounding dejected and scared, answers the best he can. The captive looks at the light of the camera, it's straining his eyes as he answers the questions. You see that his hands have been tied together using duct tape. A brief jump cut then occurs, and you see the victim crouching down with his head facing his lap. In doing this, he gives up the back of his neck, and I'm sure you guys can guess what happens next. A hitman with a machete hacks away at the back of the victim's exposed neck at least 4 or 5 times, hacking through flesh but not cutting into the bony spinal cord. Blood leaks almost immediately, and on the 4th or 5th hit, the victim completely freaks out and lets out a squeal that is incredibly high-pitched. It truly conveys the pain and utter terror that the victim must be in. The captive falls onto his side, but the hitman is grabbing him by the shirt, ensuring he can't move. The captive just covers his neck the best he can, but the hitman continues to hack away, this time aiming for the side of the captive's neck. A couple of machete blows get through, but the captive takes most of it on his arm. The victim is then turned over face first on the ground, but the captive then proceeds to protect the back of his neck with his hands. Despite this, the hitman hacks away with the machete and literally hacks through the man's fingers. You see a couple of his digits fly off as this happens. Despite this, the captive still tries to protect the back of his neck, and the hitman continues to hack away. The captive does his best to protect his neck, but in one instance, the machete essentially cuts into the man's hand vertically, almost splitting it down the middle, which causes another screech of pain from the captive. At this point, the clip jump cuts, but the same thing is essentially happening. The hitman is attempting to hack away at the back of the neck, while the victim uses his hands to try to protect himself. However, at this point, the captive's hands, well, they don't resemble hands anymore. They are just strands of flesh and mangled fingers. It's a complete mess. The victim continues to let out intermittent screams as this happens. Another jump cut transpires, and it appears that the victim can no longer defend himself, though the video at this point is so bloody, it's actually hard to make out what is going on. It appears that the hitman is hacking away at the back of the neck, but this time with no obstruction. You hear the blade clank against the spinal cord, and you also hear the victim breathing in his own blood, creating a horrid wet suction sound. Again, another jump cut, the victim at this point clearly passed out, and again, the hitman continues to hack away in the same spot, though you get a good look of just how inaccurate the hitman is with his machete strikes. It also appears that the lower back of the captive's skull has been partially destroyed. The remaining minute of the video shows the hitman struggling to hack off the head, but he eventually does. However, you see why he's been struggling so much. This wasn't conducted like a normal beheading. and it's hard to explain, but essentially, the head has been severed in a way to where the face of the victim is fully intact. It looks like your standard decapitated head from the front, but when the hitman turns the head around, you see that part of the back of the skull is missing and presumably still attached to the victim's body. There's blood everywhere on the forest ground as the head is turned around to show the camera. The hitman ends the clip by knocking the head with the machete and it ends there. The fact this video had numerous jump cuts, and despite that it was still well over 2 minutes long, makes you realise that the victim's ordeal was more than likely very long. In particular, the sight of him trying to protect himself until he passed out is also extremely harrowing. He tried his best to cling on to life, maybe in the hope that his eventual killers would have mercy on him, but this wasn't to be. The clip itself is at least 1 year old, but is one of the worst beheadings I've seen from Brazil. While I have your attention, we will discuss one last clip, which is a few years old at this point, but arguably one of Primeiro Comando de Capital's most famous or infamous execution videos. The video is 1 minute and 40 seconds, and it is filmed in a white-tiled bathroom. Where have we seen that before? The victim was said to be a member of a rival gang. As you play the video, you see the person filming walk into the bathroom, and in the bathroom, there are 2 men, a hitman and the captive. The captive has been totally strapped to a chair, his legs and arms completely immobilized so that he cannot move. He's also got a makeshift gag in his mouth, which the victim is biting down on of his own accords. He looks totally resigned to his fate despite his young age. He shows no signs of fear whatsoever, and he doesn't even attempt to speak once. He just seems accepting of his soon-to-be fate. The hitman stands over him brandishing a knife, shouting out PCC ganglines, as well as insulting the victim, before he then proceeds to attempt to cut the victim's shirt off. He spends a little bit of time doing this, but he can't fully get the shirt off. In the end, the hitman gives up, and instead, he places the blade against the victim's throat, and immediately begins to slice back and forth. The captive, however, literally makes no reaction whatsoever, aside from closing his eyes. The hitman struggles, however, to cut into the victim's throat, and this causes the hitman to become frustrated. He walks away from the captive for a second, seemingly asking for another knife, but nobody has one. He then walks back over to the captive, still brandishing the same bloody knife. This time, however, the killer forces the victim's head down, exposing the back of his neck, as well as adding tension to the neck, and then he proceeds to carry out a reverse beheading, cutting from the back of the neck. This time, the blade sinks into the victim's flesh like a hot knife through butter, and almost immediately, the hitman reaches the spine. He then uses the knife in a chopping motion to cut through the spine, and the spine is cut in rapid time in just 2 or 3 hits. At this point, you see 3 continuous spurts of blood that shoot out of the victim's neck, shooting out about a foot into the air. It looks surreal, like practical effects from a horror movie, but this is all too real. All that is holding the victim's head onto his body at this point is the skin and flesh at the front of the victim's neck, and the Sicario tries to cut it. However, he seems shocked and surprised by the continuous blood spurts, and he literally tries to dodge them as he finishes the job. He soon cuts through the remaining flesh, and he holds the bloody head up to the camera, with the gag still in the severed head's mouth. The killer shouts Primeiro Comando de Capital as he holds the head up to the camera. The headless corpse of the now deceased captive is obviously still in the chair, and it's still pumping blood, which shoots against the bathroom wall, staining it red. The head is then placed into the lap of the victim, and that is the final shot, as well as the bloody bathroom, which has been completely painted red. The video ends there. But that is the video. I hope you enjoyed it if you can enjoy this sort of content. If you're new here, of course, if you could hit subscribe, hit like, that would be much appreciated. Also, anybody out there of a Brazilian background, or anybody who knows, if there is a narco site dedicated to Brazilian gangs, Brazilian factions, please do let me know, because I'm not aware of one, and I would like to improve my coverage of cases in Brazil, because much of the time there's very little backstory, So that would be much appreciated. Also, the links to my Twitch, my Twitter will be in the pinned comments below. And yeah, as always, stay safe, and I'll catch you on the next one.